One story: the Phantom of Fort Macon. I never believed in ghosts until I was stationed at Fort Macon, a forgotten outpost deep in the swamps of North Carolina. The place reeked of decay, and the fog that rolled in every evening felt like a shroud, suffocating the life out of anyone who lingered too long. The fort had been decommissioned for decades, and our mission was to assess its condition for potential repurposing. We were told it was routine, but nothing about Fort Macon felt routine. My squad consisted of 6 men, all seasoned soldiers who had seen their fair share of strange things. But the moment we stepped foot inside the crumbling walls of the fort, an unsettling silence fell over us. It wasn't just the quiet. Something about the air felt heavy, as if the past lingered too close to the present. Our first night was uneventful. We set up camp in what used to be the officers' quarters. The walls were lined with mold, and the wooden floors creaked under our boots. But it was dry, and that was good enough. As night fell, the fog returned, thicker than before, and with it came a chill that seeped into our bones. The only light came from our flickering lanterns, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. It was just past midnight when I heard the first whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind slipping through the cracks in the old stone walls. But then it came again, clearer this time. My name. Sarge. I turned, expecting to see one of the men, but they were all asleep, huddled under their blankets. The voice called again, this time from outside the room. I grabbed my rifle and stepped into the hallway, the sound of my boots echoing in the dark. The fort was a maze of narrow corridors and empty rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Sarge? The voice was closer now, coming from down the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed it, the sound drawing me deeper into the belly of the fort. I reached a door at the end of the hallway, the wood rotting and splintered. I pushed it open, revealing a stairwell leading down into the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, then descended. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness clinging to my skin. The stairs led to a small chamber, barely large enough to stand in. At the center was a trapdoor, ancient and rusted. The voice was louder now, insistent, coming from below. I pulled the trapdoor open, revealing a tunnel that disappeared into the blackness. I should have turned back then, but something compelled me forward. I climbed down into the tunnel, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. The walls were lined with old brick, the mortar crumbling to dust. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until I lost all sense of direction. And then I saw it, a figure at the end of the tunnel, just a shadow in the darkness. I called out, but there was no response. I raised my rifle, my finger on the trigger, and took a step closer. The figure remained still, unmoving, as if waiting for me. I closed the distance between us, my breath ragged and my hands shaking. As I got closer, the figure began to take shape. An old man, dressed in a tattered Confederate uniform, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that stared through me as if I weren't there. He opened his mouth and the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a wail, a mournful cry that filled the tunnel and shook the very ground beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure reached out, his hand cold as death, and touched my arm. In that instant, I saw everything. The battles fought, the blood spilled, the lives lost. The fort wasn't abandoned. It was a tomb, a burial ground for soldiers who had been forgotten by time. I must have blacked out because the next thing I remember is waking up in the officers' quarters, the morning sun filtering through the broken windows. The men were gathered around me, their faces pale with fear. They said they had found me lying in the hallway, my rifle beside me, my eyes wide open but unseeing. We left Fort Macon that day, and I never spoke of what happened. But I can still hear that voice in my dreams, calling me back to the darkness, and I know that one day, it will come for me again. 2 story. I never believed the old stories about the echoes, those ghostly remnants of soldiers lost in the wilderness, their voices forever trapped in the wind. It was just something the older guys in the unit would talk about to scare the newbies. But that was before we got deployed to Echo Ridge. We were a small squad, sent to investigate strange reports coming from a remote outpost in Montana. They said the radios were picking up voices, faint whispers, calling out in the middle of the night. The locals avoided the area, claiming the land was cursed. We laughed it off, convinced it was nothing more than a faulty transmission. The outpost was nothing special, just a few rundown shacks and a radio tower standing tall against the backdrop of the dark, foreboding woods. The first night, everything was quiet. Too quiet. We took turns on watch, the crackle of the radio the only sound cutting through the silence. It was on the second night that things started to go wrong. I was on watch, staring out into the pitch-black forest when I heard it, a low murmur just on the edge of hearing. I grabbed my rifle, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing there. Then the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through, weak and distant. "Help! Us!" I froze. It wasn't one of ours. The voice was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I called out to the others, but when they checked the transmission logs, there was nothing there. No one else had heard it. "Just the wind," Sarge said, trying to brush it off. But I could see the unease in his eyes. The wind doesn't speak. The next night, the voices returned, clearer this time. They called out names, our names. One by one, the guys started hearing them too. It was always the same. A plea for help, followed by a garbled string of words we couldn't make out. By the fourth night, it was like the whole forest was alive with those damned voices. We decided to follow the sound, thinking it might be some kind of prank, or maybe a group of stranded hikers. We split into pairs, moving deeper into the woods, the voices growing louder, more insistent. My partner, Davis, and I ventured down a narrow trail, the others fanning out in different directions. That's when we found it. An old, abandoned bunker, half buried in the earth. The door was ajar, a cold, metallic wind seeping out from the darkness within. The voices were clearer now, almost as if they were coming from inside. Davis wanted to turn back, but something drew me in. I had to know what was inside. The bunker was cold, damp, the walls lined with rusted metal. The voices echoed around us, filling the small space with their desperate cries. And then we found them. Skeletons. Dozens of them, scattered across the floor, their bones twisted and broken as if they had died in agony. And among them, tattered uniforms, American military, just like ours. Davis bolted, but I stood frozen, staring at the horror before me. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and suddenly I understood. These were soldiers, trapped here, forgotten by time, their souls bound to the place where they had met their end. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The voices were deafening now, screaming for help, demanding to be set free. I pounded on the door, shouting for Davis, for anyone, but there was no response. The last thing I remember was the cold, bony hand that grabbed my arm, pulling me down into the darkness. They found me 3 days later, alone in the bunker, half mad with fear. The others, Davis, Sarge, all of them, were never found. The official report said they were MIA, but I know the truth. The echoes took them, just like they almost took me. And now, every night, I hear them, calling out from the darkness, begging for help. And I know someday soon, they'll come for me too. 3-story the last March. I'll never forget the night we got the call to head out to Fort Greene. It was a desolate outpost in the middle of the woods in northern Maine, long abandoned. But we were told there was strange activity up there. Lights, noises, even reports of voices over the old radio frequencies. It was supposed to be a routine mission, a quick in and out to check the place out and report back. We arrived at Fort Greene just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the last rays of daylight struggling to penetrate the thick forest. The fort was a crumbling ruin, overgrown with vines and moss. The main building was a 2-story barracks, its windows shattered and the doors barely hanging on their hinges. It was the kind of place where you could feel the weight of the past pressing down on you. "Stick together, no wandering off," Sergeant Matthews ordered. We nodded, gripping our rifles a little tighter. There was something off about the place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. We moved through the building in silence, our footsteps echoing off the walls. The rooms were empty, just piles of old, rotting furniture and papers scattered everywhere. It looked like the place had been abandoned in a hurry. As we reached the second floor, we found an old radio room. The equipment was ancient, from World War II by the looks of it, but one of the radios was still powered on, its dials glowing faintly in the darkness. "Impossible," Corporal Lee muttered. "This stuff shouldn't even be functional." Before anyone could respond, the radio crackled to life, and a voice came through, distorted and filled with static. "Fort Greene, need backup, ambushed." We froze. The voice was weak, desperate, like someone calling out from another time. Sergeant Matthews tried to respond, but all we got was static in return. Then, the voice spoke again, clearer this time. "Help us. They're coming. Can't hold them off." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, marching in unison. We spun around, but the hallway behind us was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were right on top of us. "Move! Downstairs now!" Matthews barked. We bolted for the stairs, but as we reached the first floor, the temperature dropped sharply. Our breath turned to mist in the air, and the walls began to frost over. "What the hell is this?" Private Jenkins whispered, his voice trembling. We pushed on, trying to make it to the exit, but as we reached the front door, it slammed shut in our faces. The heavy wooden door wouldn't budge, no matter how hard we pulled. The footsteps returned, this time coming from all around us, closing in. "Form a perimeter," Matthews ordered, but we were too late. The room filled with a thick, choking fog, and within it, dark shapes began to emerge. Soldiers in tattered uniforms, their faces obscured by shadows. They moved like phantoms, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Get back!" Lee shouted, firing a burst of rounds into the fog, but the bullets passed through the figures harmlessly. They kept coming, relentless, their hollow eyes locked on us. One by one, they reached out to us, their cold hands grasping at our uniforms, pulling us into the fog. My squad mates screamed as they were dragged away, their voices fading into the darkness. I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was in that room, surrounded by those things, and the next, I was outside, lying in the dirt with the dawn breaking over the horizon. The fort was gone, just vanished, like it had never been there. When I stumbled back to base, they didn't believe me. They said Fort Greene had been abandoned for decades, that there were no missions assigned there. My squad mates were listed as MIA, but I know the truth. They're still there, trapped in that place, marching forever with those ghostly soldiers. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the footsteps, marching, never stopping.